when you are in a crisis, at that moment, it can feel like doomsday. And as a leader, while everybody is saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is this the end of the company? Even that you're burning inside, as a leader, you have to keep a calm face and say, we will get out of it. Don't worry. This will pan out. The consequences usually not as bad as you expect. And you will have existential crisis several times a year. I think where founders fail is when they join the bandwagon of saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is this going to shut my company down? Second thing is, while it's good to be passionate about what you're doing, also be dispassionate to some extent, because there's only so much you can control, and control what you can. There's several aspects to your life. You are a parent, you have a spouse, you have a home, you have your health, you have your startup. Let not that startup overconsume my entire life, is what I'll tell founders. It is, you have to compartmentalize, because you are more than the success or failure of your startup.
With us today is Rahul from Tazapay. Rahul is one of those exceptional individuals that doesn't sugarcoat things. He is highly authentic and honest, and not only all that, he is incredibly smart. Rahul gives incredible perspectives on his leap from the big tech world into startup land, his initial regrets when he started, to obviously overcoming all of this to build the juggernaut that is Tazapay today. Rahul's understanding of the regional fintech landscape is second to none, and his observations and learning across hiring, building, and fundraising make this episode a must listen. Enjoy. Rahul, welcome to the first podcast.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
So maybe just to set some context for the audience, maybe if you could start with exactly what Tazapay is today, technically, commercially, how it works, etc.
We are a Singapore-based fintech licensed by MAS. And what we are is a global collection network. That's the easiest way to describe us. And it's based on three mega trends. First is that in a lot of markets, especially in emerging markets, there are real-time networks and local payment methods which have become the mainstay of economic activity in those markets. UPI in India, Alipay in China, Pay Now increasingly in Singapore, PromptPay in Thailand. So these have become the mainstay, and cards have a very small share. And so this is clearly a trend which has emerged in the last 5-6 years. The second sort of mega trend is that a lot of economic activity globally is now happening between emerging markets. So if you see the confluence of these trends, we thought that what's not available today is the ability for a merchant who wants to go global from day one to have access to all these various payment options, payment methods globally. If you're based in Singapore, it's very difficult to get access to UPI. You need to set up a local entity, get full local compliance, etc. And that's true for most payment methods. And so what we've done is we've created an infrastructure where you can get access to the local relevant options in 70 countries without the need to worry about local compliance or set up local entities. So one plugin, and you get access to UPI in India, Pix in Brazil, PromptPay in Thailand, Pay Now in Singapore, without needing to worry about local taxes, local compliance, local entities, etc. So that's kind of the first step we did. And this infrastructure then enables merchants to accept payments across the world, hold those currencies with us, and then do payouts globally. So it's a collection platform, but has the ability to collect, hold, and pay. And what we're really gunning for is that if you look at the confluence of these mega trends of local options becoming the predominant way for paying, and economic activity moving to emerging markets. The third thing which we see is that businesses now have the ability to go global from day one. They don't necessarily have to have a playbook of succeeding domestically and going global. So this is what we are serving. And I think we're very fortunate to be at the confluence of these three mega trends. And that's kind of how Tazapay was born.
Awesome. I think like when we were organizing this episode a couple of months ago, I went down a rabbit hole of videos and podcasts that you've done prior. And I really loved like your authenticity and honesty around like your journey as a founder. I found it actually really, really inspiring. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. Maybe taking a big leap back, maybe set some context for your background, upbringing, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in India, and there's no rags to riches story here. I was born into a very privileged background. My father was a senior officer. My two elder brothers were extremely well-to-do. So there's really no typical rags to riches story here. But what the story was that being the third son, I had a lot of pressure to succeed. And obviously, dad was a very well-known figure in India. My brothers were doing extremely well, so I had this super pressure to do well, and that manifested in following a rather traditional path of getting a good education, getting an MBA, finding a job with a bank, and I was well set in that path. Uh, and I worked in a corporate career for about 20 years or so. And at the end of that 20 years, I started feeling that I needed to do something which felt a little more real and meaningful and tangible for me. And that's how I started Tazapay. But a few highlights of my career were that I started with a bank in India, worked there for a couple of years, and very quickly realized that that was really not for me. It was a lot of typical paper pushing, deck making, storytelling, etc. And that really didn't satisfy me. So I joined a startup at that time in early 2001. And at that time, startups were not necessarily the norm. In fact, nobody even used to call them startups. It was just a tech company which has just been formed kind of a thing. So I started there, and it was an incredible experience. I worked with the Swedish startup for 7 years, and when I joined, there were like 15 people, and by the time I left, there were 700. We got acquired. I had the opportunity of working in 4 countries, starting with India, went to the UK, lived in Sweden, and then finally Malaysia. So great sort of grounding experience in how a business scales up, the challenges you have, etc. Obviously, I was not involved with fundraising at that time, thankfully. From there, the company got acquired. I was in Singapore. I worked with Nets, which is the incumbent debit network here.
Before we get into Nets, just as a question, maybe we can go back to that sort of journey from, being based in India where you grew up to sort of starting a more global career. I mean, was it something that from early on you had figured that was an ambition that you held, that I want to go work in a more global capacity, or was it that it came naturally in the role that you were in, that I got these opportunities and I took them? Was there a thought process around that, or?
I wouldn't say that when I was young, I had an ambition of setting up a global cross-border business. Certainly not. When I was young, I just wanted to be successful in my career, like my family was. And this just so happened that a company I joined sent me overseas. And I then really enjoyed that experience of working in a global environment. And so it was more of a transition. It wasn't really a burning ambition or anything.
Okay.
But once I started doing it, I enjoyed it and really seeped into it.
Got it. And so then you've sort of ended up in Singapore.
Yeah.
And I guess the company that you'd worked for, had that been in financial services?
Yeah, the startup I was working for, I joined a bank in my early days of my career, and I was a management trainee, and they acquired this was way back in 1998, they acquired a payment gateway.
Right.
And
a novel concept at the time.
It was a very novel concept, so much so that I was a management trainee and they asked me to oversee that acquisition. So that's how much stock they gave to that acquisition. But lucky for me, because it was really a passing fancy those days.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky enough to get that, and I've been in payments since then. We acquired that company, we integrated it into the bank, that became super successful. They finally sold it off to First Data. And the startup I joined was also into payments. We were essentially selling payment infrastructure to mobile operators such that they could offer mobile wallet services like the likes of M-Pesa and Smart Money. And so I've always been in payments in that sense. But again, coming back to the career story, so worked for Nets for a while and then was at PayPal for 10 plus years. Phenomenal experience. When I joined them, we were a $25 billion company market cap. That is including eBay. And by the time I left, it was a $300 billion company. But of course, now it's back to 65 billion. That's another story. But just went through that phenomenal growth of market cap, almost going 10x in 10 years. And many sort of learned how to scale businesses, how to scale teams, how to set up a regulated business. And in 2009, that was really the best time to set up a payment business between 2009 to 2014. Regulations were light, you could do things, what you wanted, and the regulations which would really catch up with what you would do, which was very, very different from the era we operate on now. Everything is super regulated. So I had a great experience at PayPal. Towards the end of my tenure at PayPal, I was managing PayPal's global SMB business, which is about a $8 billion P&L. So, by this time, I was increasingly again feeling like a bit of a cog in a wheel. It had become a 60,000 person organization, and what I was doing was very difficult to make a clear cause and effect relationship. And at that time, I realized that I'm happiest when I can make a cause and effect relationship. If I'm just flowing with the momentum and making decks to show my justification, it wasn't really satisfying. Although the stock was doing very well, so very difficult to leave. And then Stripe came along. I met the founders and was very, very impressed with how they had built the product culture. And at that point, I thought this is a good midway for me in being an entrepreneur with some level of security, because Stripe was still startup-ish, really. They were already valued at 35 billion, so you can't really call them a startup. But in terms of culture and thinking, they were still startups. So I joined, and I mean, it was a phenomenal experience in terms of how they build product. Their focus on the small things and how meticulously they think about product. And this is the first time they told me that the ingredients in great product is not capital. It is love, rigor, and analytics. So, this is kind of and when somebody put it that way, you realize that's how much care they take into building their products. So great experience in terms of understanding how great products are built, how teams are orchestrated. But it was increasingly a sales role because based in Singapore, I was leading APAC, but it was very focused on GTM and enterprise sales. So I was not very satisfied. I wanted to build something. And along my time at PayPal and Stripe, I had seen this particular need that these businesses were very focused on domestic commerce and not necessarily, and even if they were doing cross-border, it was a bit of a byproduct for what they had built in domestic. And it was very evident for me that there was a need for a cross-border platform which basically integrates all these local options, takes away hassles of compliance, taxes, local entities, and enables businesses to go truly global by accessing all the local payment methods globally, being able to handle that currency, handle the treasury, and do payouts. And so that's where Tazapay was born, and started in April 2020. I had obviously no idea the pandemic was about to start. I resigned in March, and April the pandemic started. Fortunately, we were able to raise some capital. Thank you, January Capital, for giving us the opportunity and trusting us at such an early stage when it was just an idea.
It's our privilege, yes.
And it's been a great journey of 4 years since then.
Maybe stepping back, and I think you've got this unique experience of looking at PayPal and the experience you had there and then coming into Stripe. And then what's happened to the two businesses subsequent to that. I mean, do you feel as though that there were cultural considerations that have informed the trajectory that Stripe may be on versus PayPal? Do you think that's just a natural journey that companies will go through at a point of maturity? It'd be interesting to get that insight because you've got that fairly unique lens that you can apply.
Yeah, both businesses, I really enjoyed my time at both places. And I spent 10 years at PayPal, 1.5 years at Stripe. So there's that has to be taken into consideration. Sure. PayPal had become too big, and moving anything became extremely difficult. And I think the learning was that people were obviously quite earnest at PayPal, but the tech debt was so heavy in terms of trying to do anything new. There was so much legacy tech. It became very difficult for the company to move fast enough. Whereas a newer company like Stripe, who had built their stack in 2012, was obviously built new, and it was much easier for them to move forward. And what I loved about Stripe was they were cognizant of this fact that over time tech debt will build, and that becomes a burden. And they had seen this happen with many big companies, including PayPal. So they were very conscious of how product is built in a modular fashion so that it doesn't become a burden later. I think so this was kind of a problem for PayPal. That the second is that once you're public, it's very difficult to balance short-term and long-term considerations. There are many times where payment companies need to cannibalize their own business. And it's very difficult when you're a public company to tell the street that I'll take a 20% hit in Q2, Q3 for the sake of Q4. Mark Zuckerberg can probably do it because he owns 75% of the stake, but very difficult for a public company. So that was another thing. And thing which I also felt culturally when it became too big and they were hiring all these consultants from McKinsey to run the company, it became a culture of internal justification and deck making. And I have taken that learning from these two companies is that I think the day in an internal meeting, if somebody has to make a PowerPoint to present to us, I feel that is a day you have to make some changes. You can make PowerPoint to present externally.
Yeah.
And I found myself in the last 2-3 years of PayPal spending 50-60% of the time making presentations internally to prove a point. And there was a point I found I would go into a meeting, my team had prepared a deck which was going to be presented to my boss. And I'm reviewing the deck and correcting the headlines of the deck. Oh, it should be like this. And that time the realizations came to me that this is not really what I want to do in life.
That's a good leading indicator.
Yeah. Wait a second. We speak to a number of different founders on this program, and it's like, they come from these really reputable companies, like in big tech, etc. And I guess the question to you is, like, now that you're in the midst of this journey with Tazapay, in reflection, like, what are some of those kind of key traits or hard skills or soft skills that you would have learnt over that time with PayPal or Stripe, etc., that have kind of set you up to be in a good spot for Tazapay? Now, obviously, it's not PowerPoints, but what are the good things that you can kind of reflect and go, yep, that was actually beneficial to me getting to where I am today with Tazapay?
No, that's a great question. PayPal taught me everything I know about payments, to be honest. So eternally grateful for what I learned there. And a few things which PayPal did extremely well, which helped me and my team. A lot of my leadership team is also ex-PayPal and Stripe. So was that the operating model, how you set up your company so that it is fully compliant yet has the flexibility. And I'll give a specific example. PayPal operates in 140 markets with 12 licenses. And the way they do that is a very unique model that everybody signs up for a service from their Singapore entity, which is licensed. And then they are able to give them collect, hold, and payout services. And we took a lot from that playbook. So we are licensed in Singapore. And today we have customers in 67 countries. And we are able to operate with this pivotal license that we have. Not only that, we have collection services in 72 countries today, from Brazil to Mexico to US to Europe to Vietnam, Philippines. And if I had to get licenses in each of these countries, that will take me 25 years. But we were able to do this in 4 years because of the operating model that we take one strong license, a gold standard license, onboard merchants with that, as well as onboard all our payment partners and banks with that license. So I think that operating model would have been very difficult to operationalize if me and my team did not have that learning at PayPal. So that was one. Second, I think in terms of people culture, how do you coach a team? I think PayPal had great learning in terms of that when you are on a journey from being an individual contributor, excellent individual contributor to a manager. How do you reward people who just are not excellent themselves, but are able to multiply themselves? And I think that's what I learned. And this is what I value about the American corporate culture. There's a lot not to value, but this is something which is I really value, that the way they create cultures that good performers can multiply themselves. So I think this is another great learning that I took. How to identify, how to coach people, how to groom them, how to make sure that they are multiplying themselves and not being. And one thing which I again took away in a lot of my experience was that trust in leadership is always inversely proportional to self-orientation. And I feel that the less self-oriented you are in getting your own name out there, taking credit, the less your trust is. It's quite intuitive, but very difficult to follow in a big corporate environment where your promotion depends on those proof points. I think less so in a startup. And I think that's another trait that I look for in people I hire from big companies, because they have the experience which I need, but they also come with this baggage of having to prove themselves. So finding that balance, that people who are not self-oriented. And again, I had spoken about this earlier, that when I look at total compensation for anybody, it is of course equity, stock, plus a sense of agency. Most people get frustrated in the big tech companies because the sense of agency becomes almost zero. You can't get anything done. You can just keep trying to influence. Whereas in a smaller company or startup, you can get things. So I also like to hire people who value the sense of agency, and that's quite easy to gauge in an interview. As in, what's motivating you? Why do you want to leave? And if I hear those things that, I love what I'm doing, but I really want this. I have this eagerness to build something, to do something which is real and hold. Those are really the golden signals for me to hire somebody.
I want to come to hiring and specifically co-founders in a second and how you approach that. I guess we're touching on right now like the kind of the start of Tazapay in some respects, and we talk a lot with founders about what is your wedge in, and what was your sort of wedge in for Tazapay at the beginning? Because I have heard you reference about trust specifically. Was it trust as something as soft as that, or was there hard kind of technicalities around finding a wedge in for Tazapay in the markets?
We thought our wedge would be trust, to be honest. Initially, we had built an escrow system, and the idea was quite simple: that buyer and seller don't trust each other. They come to us. We codify the terms of the trade, we collect the money, and we release it only once the transaction is complete and give protection on both sides. Because this is what I had learned at PayPal, that people were using PayPal because there was inherent protection built in. And that's what we started building. Very soon I realized that while we might be saying that we'll create the trust in the transaction, the merchants were saying, why do I trust you? You are a nobody, no entity, no license, no name. And so in a way, we had to pivot away from that in terms of becoming an infrastructure provider for global collections. And trust became a bit more inherent and implicit rather than... Because what I also realized, if you try to lead with trust, that is something which is taken for granted and a given, right? So that's where our journey, we had a pivot from being a trust-centric company based on escrow to becoming more of a payment processing company with a global reach.
I think that's such an interesting point, because I remembered when we were doing our own diligence at the time that we had the privilege of investing, we went and actually spoke to a lot of merchants, right? And I think there was more than 100. And the feedback that we received back was universally positive, that if something like this existed, we would absolutely use it. But I think it's a really interesting point that we can come back to later on, which is sometimes listening to your customers, it's not actually just a perfect solution, right? But it's just interesting that I think the idea was so simple, it made sense, but as we learned over time, there was a need to probably build something of greater scale.
That's right.
Earn that trust and then come back to maybe something like that in the future.
It's an interesting point because many founders, when they start, they do validation calls and speak to customers, and we did quite a few. I had a little bit of hubris because I thought I had done a lot of it at PayPal and Stripe, so there was an assumption. But when you go to a merchant and say, is trust a problem? They'll say, of course it is. And I think the question to ask is, what are the top 3 things on your mind when you get up in the morning? And that lack of trust is not the top, among the top 3.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a confirmation bias in some of these interviews. And I think it's quite important when you do your validation, let's not ask such leading questions and direct questions.
So let's maybe touch on co-founders. So maybe a mini introduction for them, as well as, how you identified them. And, we have a lot of founders listening to this, and they're kind of going through the ideation of who to pick and who to select to join them on their kind of vision. Just how you approach that in those early days.
Great question. So I had, when we started, my 2 co-founders, so 3 of us, myself, Saroj, who... as a chief operating officer, he came from a banking background, and he had quit his banking job in 2012 and set up an investment advisory business. So nothing to do with payments, but he had been prodding me on. He had been my friend for many years. Let's do something. You have this experience. I have the entrepreneurial experience. So it started with that. So the experience he bought, that he had done the hustle earlier, and he gave me the courage to quit my job and do it because he had done it earlier. And then we both wanted to start, and then we quickly realized that neither of us have a tech background. So fortunate, I had met Rahul, my third co-founder, who's the CTO. He was the CTO of Grab earlier, and he was my customer at Stripe. And I had a lot of respect in the way he dealt with people and the way he managed our relationship as a partner, etc. So there was no way for me to judge his technical skills at that time, but I felt he was a great human being, and which was a good tick mark for me. So that's how we three met and we started, and we I thought we had complementary skills, but at some point within the first 1.5 years, we felt there was a fair amount of overlap which caused conflict. And this was my learning as well. In corporate environments, when you are a GM of a business or a department head, the hierarchy is very clear. This is what I think, this is what I do. Whatever shenanigans you may do around consensus building, ultimately the buck stops at you. But I found this very interesting learning for me. When you have co-founders, even though you have a hierarchy that you are CEO, it's very difficult to say I do it because I'm saying so. So a lot of consensus building and influencing, which is a new skill I learned, to be honest. I thought I had it, but it wasn't there. Over time, we hired two more really senior leaders, Kanupriya, who leads growth, and Ayush, who's the head of product and payment partnerships. So in NCB, they're part of the founding team. We consider them as co-founders. So that's how this organization is built now today.
And so you double clicking on a bit of that there. So you really emphasize with co-founders is having, I guess, clear, direct conversations, the difficult conversations, and then bringing them to air is sort of what you're getting at.
That's right. I wanted to lead into that a little bit, is that when you have co-founders, initial co-founders, and you expand the team, it's quite natural to have conflicts. And many times, myself included, people try to push them down. Or let's get to Series A, then we'll try to resolve it. Or let's do this milestone because it's an uncomfortable situation. Either you want to tell your co-founder that what you're doing is not up to expectation, or you're not adding value here, or this is not what you're doing. And you try to avoid that conversation because it's uncomfortable. If it's an employee-employer relationship, it's much easier. And
for sure.
And I found it quite difficult to do that in my initial days. And I'm assuming my co-founders found it quite difficult to do that as well. We had many deliberate discussions on that. I think after 1.5 years, we got the rhythm where we could call people out. And it would get really heated. And usually it would be, you're blaming me, but you haven't done this, and then you haven't done this. And people would then go back and pick up a laundry list of items they were not happy with, and then you had to bring it to point. And very often I would be sitting in the leadership meeting and seeing people having go at each other, and I didn't know when to stop in, when to lean in, when to not. So this was a very new skill for me. And the thing I realized was, and this is kind of, hopefully it's useful for the others, when you're in a big corporate environment, people are trained and groomed to be polite to each other, even if they have a grudge, because sky doesn't fall if somebody doesn't do their job. And they will be polite, and they will be woke, and they will back each other, and maybe they'll crib later. But in a startup environment where stakes are so high, because if somebody's not doing their job, it's impacting me, my opportunity cost is so high of doing this, that usually emotions are much higher. So this was my realization. So the big thing I did was that rather than try to stop the conflict, be comfortable with the conflict. As long as people don't take that ill feeling out of the door.
Yeah.
So this is what we have set up as a norm, that we'll fight like crazy, but when we walk out, we'll not carry a grudge. And whatever we have to say, we say in the room. And sometimes it gets really, really uncomfortable because it tends to get super personal. So my learning in this is, I wish I had done it earlier. Let people get as personal as possible. Just lay it out there. People will get angry. But that honesty is much more important in a startup environment than a corporate environment. And the skill there is to get comfortable with it and not get perturbed. I don't think I'm still there. I still get perturbed. But I'm trying to develop that skill.
I think, is it fair to say, though, that for that to operate at a level which leads to a positive resolution, that the underlying basis there needs to be an element of trust, right?
Right.
Which is that I know that when I walk out of this room, that I'm not going to feel as though I was personally attacked. It's purely around the problem at hand, and we all still each have each other's back, right? I think, and so you've got to be able to be comfortable with the conflict, but be constantly focused, I imagine, on building out culture so that people feel as though it's not going to carry back to the day-to-day outside of that meeting.
That is true, and it's easier said than done, to be honest, because it's very difficult to segregate the professional part and the personal part.
For sure.
It does tend to get personal. I think as a leader, what I realized is what you have to be conscious is that does it get political? Are people trying to protect their turfs? Or is there in the corporate environment, it's quite easy to detect it because everybody's gunning for the next promotion, right? So most of it is centered around that. Hey, there's no promotion or anything. It's the only promotion is this, the next round you raise and the valuation uptick, right? So, so I kind of keep a filter on for if it gets political, and thankfully I'd say it never gets political. It's, people are doing it out of the best interest.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have to be called out, but sometimes you have to call out somebody directly. It's better done in a one-on-one environment in front of 4 people, but it's a tough balance. But I think the story I have here is that getting comfortable with those uncomfortable conflicts as early as possible is the best. And this is especially for people who come from large corporate environments, but they have absolutely no habit of doing it.
One of the things we like to ask founders is the first day of their journey. I mean, do you remember, you sort of mentioned it was leading into the start of COVID, it sounds like, but what was that day one? I mean, what do you remember around that first foundational weeks of being the founder, of realizing I've left this, very well-paid, comfortable corporate role where I had a lot of responsibility, and I'm now kind of back doing 0 to 1. What was that like?
It was terrible. There was no sense of euphoria. It was terrible for me, and I think its journey is different for everybody. And I sort of compare it with when you become a father or a mother first time, right? Especially for dads, there's this general perception that the moment the kid arrives, you have this moment of euphoria and a truck full of love hits you. For most people, it's not the case. It takes a while, right? First feeling is, oh my God, all this responsibility and, the bonding. I felt it was similar to me when I quit. I was very confused why I did it. Although I had all the reasons, I had documented why I'm doing this.
Like having a child for the first time.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I had documented all of this as to why I'm quitting. I want a sense of agency. I want to build something. And then I quit, and COVID hit as well. And 2-3 months were very confusing, to the extent that in the 4th or 5th month, I seriously considered quitting and going back to corporate life. And one mistake I did was when I had quit, at both places, PayPal and Stripe, I had an implicit offer to come back, more so at PayPal. And I somehow had kept this door open that if this doesn't work out, I can always walk back. And COVID time, the payment industry was at its all-time high. So I was getting silent offers all the time.
Yeah.
And I was not saying no. I was saying, yeah, maybe I'll consider. Let's have a chat. I'm doing this. I wanted to keep an option open, and that confused the hell out of me because I was regretting this. By this time, I had hired people. We had raised money. So you can't just leave, right? It's like a reputation. And I was regretting because one was, of course, the financial part. Yeah. The part which was harder was you became a nobody. In senior corporate roles, I was APAC head of Stripe. And if I called somebody, 99% that person called me back. Or if I send an email, I got a response. Now, nobody was returning my calls. Nobody was returning my emails. And I had no card. I never had to explain, hey, I work with PayPal, this is what they do. So there was a sense of identity. And that sense of loss of that identity was very, very hard when I started, to the extent that I was regretting it deeply. And I said, maybe I should take one of these offers. But I was also scared about what it means in terms of reputation, whether I will never be able to do it again type of thing. So I had this conflict for the longest time. And I remember I'd quit in April, and in October I said, okay, I'm going to give it 4 more months. I wrote it down. If I still feel so miserable at the end of 4th month from now, I'll take an action because there's no point being so miserable. And then few things changed. So I felt like I had empowered myself to take a decision rather than a decision imposed on me now. That was empowering. And then slowly when the product was launched, I started feeling very good because the period when you've quit and the product is being built, you are in no man's land. There's nothing to talk about. You're just discussing. So when the product was launched and we started getting our first few transactions, that's when it started feeling a bit more gratifying. Then I was able to hire one of my old colleagues into the leadership team, Kanu. And I think she made a big difference, got a lot of energy, and then started hiring more people. So I think that transformed me. By the end of the 4th month, I had sort of totally decided this is what I want to do. And I mean, if I look back, after 4 years, it was the right decision. We are a reasonably good place now. We are 150 people. We were awarded among the top 100 fintechs in the world by CB Insights. We've raised over $20 million. We have thousands of customers, billions of dollars of volume. So it does feel very gratifying now. But the first year was very hard.
That is so refreshing because I think a lot of founders tend to look back with rose-colored tinted glasses, right? In the sense that once they've had the success, they look back and they go, "Oh, it wasn't that bad." Sort of like having a child, but I think that the reality is it is really hard, right? For you was, you sort of talked about the moments in time that started to sort of shift that. I mean, if you went back and did it again, what would you do differently? What would it be that you needed to shut that door earlier on so that you were sort of all in? That's easier than said than done. What would you change if you were starting again?
One is I would not keep option B open, at least not in the first year.
Yeah.
I would, anybody who called me a recruiter, I'd say, no, I'm committed to my startup. I can't do this. I'd not entertain. So I think mentally it would have been better if I had shut that door for myself to please myself. I think the second thing is the biggest ingredient I felt was there's capital, there's a lot of other things. The biggest thing is clarity. I feel we did not have clarity in the first year of what we wanted to build. It was based on vague notions and some doctored interviews with customers on what we wanted to do. Not doctored deliberately, but leading them, right? This whole thing. And I felt, and everybody was looking at me to give clarity because I had this 25 years experience in payments. And this became a baggage. My experience became a baggage because nobody was challenging me. They say, oh, Rahul is saying must be true, including the investors. So, and that became a baggage, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the learning was, I have to preface now, this is what I think, but maybe I don't know. So give the room for people to challenge. But now we've had really strong senior people who will do what they're convinced about rather than what I'm saying. But initial days, that became a baggage. So I took a wrong turn in the company. Initially, we built this escrow product based on a notion, and it took away about 1.5 years in the company's life because we built, it didn't succeed, and then we had to rebuild the whole platform last year. And now I think we're on a great trajectory because we have clarity. So I think lacking the clarity is the biggest thing. I'd say that is the biggest ingredient. So what I would do is not rush into it. And I'll relate it back to this thing about, because I had left a corporate environment, I was drawing millions of dollars a year. And now I had gone to a place where I was drawing almost no salary. I had taken this pressure on myself that fail fast. Do it quickly. If it doesn't succeed, go back. And because I had put this pressure on myself, I think we took wrong decisions on doing this product because that seemed the one we had some level of consensus of what we built. There was some amount of validation. And if I didn't have this time pressure and spent a bit more time in trying to validate it really, I think we would have built what we have built now 3 years earlier and been much further ahead in our journey. So putting this pressure on yourself of time, and again, it comes because of senior corporate leaders have this in their mind that I have an opportunity cost of doing this. And I can say this honestly today because this, that's completely out, but this is what was my biggest learning. So I think the advice there is if senior corporate leaders come, firstly, they have completely killed their bridges from their past life, saying, we are doing this for the right reason. There is no going back. And then, so that relieves a lot of pressure. So this was kind of my unique personal journey.
You know, I think you've sort of answered a lot of it there, but I was going to ask you around like how you guys viewed MVP. Like you've kind of like looked at the no man's land before there's an early product. But it sounds like you've obviously learned some hard lessons and you've changed the product suite since then. But how do you then think through product market fit? Like, is it a real thing? Is it a mirage? If it's a real thing, how do you know you have it? Is it metrics? Is it qualitative? What do you think?
This is a great question. And I've asked this many times myself. When do you know you have product market fit? There are few indicators there. The first indicator is merchants are telling you that we really love it. But that rarely happens in payments. Secondly, because there'll always be one or two failed transactions and they will fixate on it. The second, I think the most tangible for me is the repeatability of the use case. Because we have such an extensive, if every new customer is coming to you for a new requirement and you're having to customize and do backflips to service that use case, you're still slightly away from product market fit. But when you see the same thing again and again and again, the repeatability of the use case to me, at least in our business, seemed the most tangible indicator of product market fit. I think going back to your question of MVP, this is a fairly tough one because if you are entering a market where you have incumbents who've got the similar product and you try to launch an MVP with lesser features, you're not going to make any traction. So at best, it has to be at least slightly at par. So the approach we took was we'll match what an incumbent is offering plus more, but where we may compromise to get to market faster is all the back-end stuff. We have a large team in India, operations, etc. So we could have the luxury of doing things manually. So pick up the transaction on the front end and then back end we don't automate and do a manual transaction. So being a bit like a coffee machine where you press a button and the coffee comes out, where the back somebody is actually making the coffee and delivering. So that was our notion, create the facade and the front end first and the back end. And then once we see proof point that it will succeed, then you go and build the back end.
Awesome. And I want to gear shift to the people side of the business because I think that that's an area that you seem quite passionate about. And you've kind of referenced already that there were a couple of key early hires which were pretty pivotal to the business. How do you get those people on board? You know, when we think about moving from like a big tech luxury background and you're kind of having, great pay package and you're taking the jump essentially for someone else's vision, how do you incentivize for that? Or how do you kind of convince people to join you?
It takes a long time. You know, none of the really pivotal people joined in 2 weeks. It took months and months of discussions and convincing, and relates to the point earlier. How important is a sense of agency for them? Is sense of agency important? Is that what they're craving for? And a lot of them are. But some of them have life event. They've just had a kid, just bought a house. So even though they are miserable, not doing anything, they'll stay on. So finding those people who have the luxury of taking a salary cut and value the sense of agency, value of doing something more than the cut, I think is the type of people you have to identify. And, that's what we did with some of the senior hires that found they were really craving to do something real and build something. So that's kind of fun thing. Second is identifying what their career objectives are. What I tell everybody who joins Tazapay, that I cannot guarantee Tazapay will be successful and you'll make a millionaire. I cannot guarantee that. Hopefully you will. But what I can guarantee is that if you spend a few years here, you will learn a lot, you'll grow professionally, and your employability will be much more after Tazapay than it was you being a cog in a wheel in a big corporate. And I think that's usually my sales pitch to them, and usually it comes true.
Pitch.
I mean, who wants to hire somebody who's spent like 15 years in a bank? Everybody knows their traits, right? But if they've spent 15 years in a bank and come and work for a startup like us for 2-3 years, I think their employability and their market improves a lot, because a lot of people are then willing to take a bet. They say, okay, you have proven that you're not just a paper pusher and a deck maker, but really have the gumption to do something. So that's kind of the pitch I make.
Do you feel like with the experience that you had coming out of large corporates, you were really well equipped on hiring? I mean, have you been able to manage that part of the business fairly well? Or would you say that there's been learnings there over time where you are much more capable, hirer and acquirer of talent today than you were when you started out 4 years ago?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, in large corporates, you're always thinking at the back of my mind that will this person be able to save my face or not? In a way, intrinsically, you're thinking in large corporates.
Yep.
How will, if my boss catches hold of him in a lift, what will he say and how will it reflect? That kind of nonsense is there.
Sure.
But, and so even though intuitively, I don't have to value those skills, it's somewhere there. You're looking for people who are naturally polished and naturally suave and, that kind of a thing which you would do. And I think those were mistakes. I overvalued those skills in the initial years.
Interesting.
Rather than real sense of agency, grit, resilience, integrity. Those were skills I think I value much more now than how you present yourself. And how to gauge, I think, comes with experience, the type of questions and how they interact, etc.
I've heard you say before, just regarding B2B payments in general, that that specific sector was about 30 years behind where B2C was at, essentially. And I kind of want to double click on just your view of how you've kind of made the Tazapay business model hum, essentially, and how you sort of predict this kind of business model evolving into the future to kind of play catch up in some realms.
Few major changes. What we're saying, the most of B2B has been predicated on swift transfers, and these are super inefficient. Costs are not transparent. Speeds are a problem, and so it's time for a shakeup. But it's quite challenging because of first of all, Swift, for all its deficiencies, has a high trust element to it. People know that the money will come in, and there's a lot of compliance built into it. The sender name is the receiver. So that's where it's been quite challenging to disrupt it. Swift themselves are trying to disrupt it. And you have to see the fundamental problem why B2B is broken is that it works on this notion of requiring liquidity everywhere. So if I'm sending money from DBS Singapore to Deutsche Bank in Germany, the money takes 2 days to go. Not because the message takes 2 days to go. Swift will send you the message instantly. It takes 2 days because Deutsche Bank is not going to credit the beneficiary unless they know they're good for the money and DBS has parked the money. So you have this really complicated mechanism of people having to park liquidity in Nostro-Vostro accounts across the world, and there's a netting off process. And sometimes there's no bilateral relationship. There are corresponding banks. So it's a fairly complicated situation there. And this is where a lot of us are quite enthused by two things. First is the notion of stable coins, because each of these stable coins have intrinsic liquidity. So when I get a stable coin, a USDC or a USDT, I know it's good for money, and because there's enough backing to that coin that I can. So this is something which I am very excited about, that stable coin as a conduit for money transfer, which solves the speed and liquidity problem, and that has multiple use cases associated with it, is something which we are quite excited about. The second notion is that if you can find a way to have a hub and spoke model that in key markets, the fintech itself can park liquidity, then you don't need to rely on this corresponding bank. And I'll give a specific example. We have a freight forwarding, a public listed company who uses us for payment collections in multiple markets. And so they want to collect in Vietnam. And usually it would take 4 days for the Swift to come, and then only then the freight will get booked and the ship will happen. So it required a lot of logistics. But now what we do is we give them a local bank account in Vietnam in their name. We've got the regulatory approvals to do that. And so the local freight forwarder just does a local transfer. It happens instantly. So I've got Vietnamese dong there, and I will offset that with my US dollar liquidity in Singapore and do a transfer there, or my euro liquidity in Germany to pay them. So I am able to perform that function in a limited way and solve this problem. And so this reduced their entire sales cycle by 3 days, because I solved this problem of creating local receptacles in a lot of these markets to receive the local currency, and then using that currency to do offsetting and paying off. So I think these are the two areas where it's ripe for disruption. It'll take a long time because it is, several $1 trillion of volume going through. But we are very excited that we can make a dent here in solving real use cases, especially for the digitally native and the digitally savvy companies.
I know the answer to this question at a broad level, but I'd love to get the sort of deeper take. I think there's been a complete re-rating of fintech in public markets since the conclusion of the pandemic. And, you referenced PayPal, but they're not immune, like they're not the only ones that have been affected by it. It's sort of across the board. And I think when you sort of listen to analyst reports, the question is are we already at a point of saturation with fintech, and is the problem solved? And we certainly don't believe it is. We still think that there's a lot of, there's decades of innovation that need to come. But I guess what's your perception with the experience that you have? And I guess looking through it now with the lens of Tazapay of, what should we expect to see and where is the market really at? Because everyone sort of assumes problems are solved, but it sounds like in many respects we're still in a very manual, paper-based economy in many respects.
I mean, there are multiple questions in that question.
It's a big one.
The re-rating has happened, but to be honest, during the pandemic, the rating associated with these fintechs was a bit crazy. When I was at PayPal, I could not believe why somebody was giving 100 multiple on the earning. And we're happy to take it, obviously. But I could not understand why the multiple was so high. And I think during the pandemic, it went even higher. So there is a little bit of rationalization to that extent. And we are in the money business, so we are directly correlated to interest rates, obviously. Because as interest rates go up, these businesses do suffer because a lot of them are cash businesses. So that's one part of the public market. I think the pendulum has swung too much. It went from 100 multiple to now a 10 multiple. Hopefully it'll swing back to a bit more reasonable levels of 25, 30, 35 is where we think it should be. I'm not a financial market expert, but I would invest in a fintech business at those multiples as an investor. In terms of whether it's a solved problem, give you some statistics. About 7 to 10% of all retail is online. 90% is still offline. In B2B, I would say 98% is an offline mechanism through paper forms and SWIFT transfers. So if you look at a macro view, we are just, have total addressable market will only increase by about 40-50% year on year is our view. So that's one view of it. There are certain areas in the fintech ecosystem which seem to be fairly saturated. Card processing is one. It's a low effort. Moats are difficult to build. Obviously, Stripe has built a great moat in terms of product. But that I feel seems to be trending to saturation. Although I heard the same argument in 2012 when Stripe was being formed and said card processing is a solved problem. PayPal's already solved it. And then Adyen and Stripe both became $50 billion, $100 billion companies. So, there is a way where innovators can prove you wrong in that sense. But the area where we are targeting, which is a global collection infrastructure, collect, hold, and pay, there are only 3 or 4 companies globally who are doing it in our peer group. And the TAM, it's quite easy to bottom this up. It's more than $1 trillion. So I think there are even if 100 more players come, I think there's enough, and it's not a winner take all market. Because unlike card processing, B2B can be nuanced. There is geographies. There are certain geographies which not everybody can do. There are certain things around currency. Which currencies can you hold? How do you manage disputes? How do you do chargebacks? So it's nuanced. One person will not be able to take all market like Stripe did for card processing. So that's kind of my view. So we are nowhere close to saturation in my view.
I feel we've talked about product and business model and how you kind of envision the future there, but I guess my question is what kind of keeps you up at night? What is actually the biggest challenges that you kind of foresee tackling in the short to midterm?
We have multiple areas which can keep people up at night. I think the biggest one is the regulatory challenge. Managing that well, given that we have such a broad infrastructure in so many markets, keeping on top of it and making sure, even though your intention is very pure, that you don't want to do anything which crosses the line or in terms of risk or compliance and AML, I think keeping a handle on it is quite difficult because there are so many people coming in wonky ways. So I think that's which is top of my mind. That I tell my investors in my company that Many companies take a position that we are a product first company, tech first company, sales first company. We are a compliance first company because of our operating model. That we operate in 70 countries, we onboard customers for so many countries. We can help a Thailand customer collect from Brazil by signing up with our Singapore entity. So the burden is much higher for us. So that is what the number one consideration on my mind, that we want to have the most world-class compliance and risk framework and background. The second one which keeps me up is, although we have very smart people in the company, they can get itchy when, especially if you have 1 quarter of down or 1 quarter of not so good performance, people can tend to get quite nervous. Again, because all of them are also evaluating their opportunity cost. So constantly reiterating that, don't look at these short-term signals. Know that we have leading indicators that we will be hugely successful in the long term. I think that's the second one. Those are the two which occupy my mind most of the time.
Interesting. I think, one of the topics that founders really like to dive into as part of this podcast is the fundraising journey. And I just, you've obviously had some success there and you're a bit more of a kind of veteran in some respects, but, how did you approach that first fundraising round for Tazapay? Like, was there actually a process? Did you have key investors in mind? Did you have a quantum or a number in mind? How did that work?
We were very fortunate because of timing, because that time was really the boom time of for fintechs. So in a way, we were almost pursued by certain investors, and we had we had the luxury of choosing our investors, and we're very glad we chose ChanCap because showed conviction on what we were building, had a lot of knowledge on what we were building, were committed to the market. So it was a little more during seed funding. It was a bit more us choosing our investors.
I remember.
Which I think we were very fortunate of to do. Series A got much tougher. I think my battle scars are for Series A, and it got really, really tough because by the time the slump was in full flow, PayPal had gone from $320 to $55. And that was really the bellwether of fintech, because that's kind of one of the few public companies. Stripe, which was in the secondary market, was trading at 185 billion, had come down to 40-50 billion. So it was a real crunch time. Nobody had belief. People were looking for reasons for not investing. I think what helped in this case was having a clear narrative on what you're doing, what problem you're solving. Sometimes if you go to a meeting and say, I have this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature, I think answering the question, so what problem are you solving? So I had to pivot my story from going a bit more macro. This is the global problem. This is what we are solving. And very quickly, I realized that the two questions I had to answer every time was, what is your total addressable market? And isn't this too crowded already? And I'm assuming most founders are going for Series A, Series B. These are the first two questions you need to answer. What is your real addressable market and why are you different? And the thing I feel there is, this was a great insight given to me for one of my investors, is when we were doing our escrow solution and we wanted to be different. He says, you don't need to be different all the time. If the market is big enough and you're in mainstream market, there will be other players. So you just have to find your market niche there, in your industry niche there, and execute well. So always trying to show that I'm different, my competitor than others. I think it's okay to say I'm very similar to them, but I beat them in these markets and these segments because of these reasons. So either you can be a niche player, which is extremely different than anybody else, but usually very often the TAM is going to be damn small there. But if you are in the mainstream, which is $1 trillion market, of course there are going to be competitors. You can't get both, right? So I feel like juggling that was quite difficult. So the moment we started addressing the TAM question and our right to win within that TAM, and not predicated on that we are very different from anybody else, I think that's where the story started sticking.
I think that's one of the things that we see as well, is that founders come in and it's actually more about, we'd almost say SAM, right? Like, what is that specific addressable market? And being able to say that, yes, it's $1 trillion, but even if we carve out this $20 billion industry, and this is why we do that better, we certainly resonate with that, because it's as though you've gone beyond that first order thinking and you're like, look, I appreciate there's going to be 15 people doing it, but if we do these things really well, we can build a really interesting, enduring business of scale, right? If you if you think about the future, you think about the future of Tazapay and the vision. I mean, you've spoken about where it's come from, what it is today, and very impressive, Rahul, and what you guys have built and will continue to build. What does the company look like in 5 years' time?
There are multiple metrics of measuring and evaluating what we can be, but I think my North Star goal and the company's North Star goal is to be the default option for anybody who's doing global collect, hold, and pay. We want to be the number one preferred option, default option for collect, hold, and pay. And what that means is that we want to have the widest network for payment collections in a fully compliant way across the world. This serves multiple constituents, including marketplaces, B2B travel, gaming companies, which is the video game, mobile gaming companies, e-commerce companies, traditional importers and exporters. So a most expansive collection network, most expansive treasury network for holding multiple currencies and then being able to do payouts in a super compliant way. I think that'll be my North Star vision, that we are collecting in 100 countries, paying in 130 countries, and supporting 70 currencies is the first metric. Second metric would be that we have a certain scale to this business. I think we have the right to be processing more than 500 billion in 5 years. We are already doing billions of dollars of volume. So about $500 of billion dollars of volume are trending to $1 trillion in the next is when, and be supremely compliant and licensed in about 8 to 10 markets, because that is the biggest moat you can have. A license in a market with a direct banking relationship, that takes extremely long for anybody to catch up with. So those are the 2 or 3 things which I think about where I want to be in the next 5 years.
And as we look to close off, I guess for the founders listening, what would be any parting war stories or learnings that you would want to emphasize?
When you are in a crisis or in a firefighting mode, a customer churned, in trouble with the board, investor withdrawing their term sheet. I'm just giving examples. Hopefully it doesn't happen with everybody. Challenge with the regulator. At that moment, it can feel like doomsday. And as a leader, while everybody is saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is this the end of the company? Even that you're burning inside, as a leader, you have to keep a calm face and say, we will get out of it. Don't worry. This will pan out. It is usually, the consequences usually not as bad as you expect. Just have to keep a calm head and go forward and have reasonably. So I think that's kind of where it is. And you will have existential crisis several times a year. I think where founders fail is when they join the bandwagon of saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is this going to shut my company down? And the second thing is, while it's good to be passionate about what you're doing, also be dispassionate to some extent, because there's only so much you can control, and control what you can. There's several aspects to your life. You are a parent, you have a spouse, you have a home, you have your health, you have your startup. Let not that startup overconsume my entire life, is what I'll tell founders. It is, you have to compartmentalize, because you are more than the success or failure of your startup.
Rahul, I love that authenticity. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on the first podcast.
Thanks, Rahul.
Thank you so much.